They said the vow was older than the mountains, older than the families themselves, a promise carved in silence, binding children before they could even speak. But what happens when the one raised for that vow decides to run? Before we dive into this story, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, and let's step together into the shadow of the Appalachians. The ridges rose like silent walls, their slopes thick with spruce, chestnut, and hickory, holding the valley below in a hush that seemed eternal. In the folds of those mountains, the days stretched long and quiet, broken only by the barking of dogs, the whir of cicadas, and the sound of a hammer striking wood on some distant homestead. It was here, deep in the Appalachian range, that the McAllister family had rooted themselves for generations, clinging to old ways and older promises, as if time itself bent differently on their land. Eleanor McAllister was born in late October, when the leaves had turned fire-red and gold, carpeting the forest floor with a softness that muffled every footstep. Her mother, Ruth, labored in the drafty cabin with only her husband's sisters in attendance, for no doctor came that far up the holler, and no midwife dared cross the ridge without invitation. When the girl was placed in her mother's arms, she was pink and squalling, her fists tight, her eyes an unearthly grey that seemed already to search the rafters for something unseen. Ruth pressed her lips to the child's damp forehead and whispered a prayer that she might grow strong, for strength was what the mountains demanded of anyone who hoped to outlast them. Her father, Silas, stood outside the cabin that night, smoking a corncob pipe and staring at the ridgeline. He had waited, shoulders tight, until the cry of the newborn split through the thin walls. Only then did he lower his head, close his eyes, and murmur words that no one else would hear. They were not words of thanks, not quite. They were words of memory, words passed down to him since boyhood, when his own father had placed a hand on his shoulder and told him of the vow. The vow was older than the cabin, older than Silas's father or his father's father. It had been carried across ridges and valleys, whispered in kitchens and on porches, always binding the McAllisters to the neighboring family, the Hales. The vow was simple in its bones, a daughter raised for a son, and a son promised for a daughter. No matter the generation, no matter the hardship, the two lines would be joined again and again, so that their land and their blood would never scatter. That night, when Eleanor first drew breath, Silas knew the path set before her. She was to be raised not only as his daughter, but as the bride to the Hale boy, born just 6 months earlier on the other side of the ridge. The Hale family had already declared it, sending word down the trail with a cousin who stopped at the McAllister porch carrying a sack of apples and a smile that was more binding than any paper document. Ruth had looked down at her infant with both love and fear when she heard the words spoken aloud. She had been raised under the same traditions, but she had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that they might loosen with time, like worn rope fraying after too many years of use. Yet her husband's jaw had set firm when the cousin delivered the message. There was no discussion. Eleanor's life was already entwined with another's before she had even opened her eyes to the world. The seasons shifted, as they always did. Winters came hard in those mountains, with snow burying the narrow paths and smoke curling from the chimneys like thin lifelines against the cold. Eleanor grew from swaddled infant to toddling child, her grey eyes still carrying that searching look, her laughter rare but bright when it came. She learned to walk on uneven floors, to climb the steep yard where chickens scratched at the dirt, and to sit silently while her mother spun wool by the fire. Silas was not unkind to her, but there was distance in his regard. He carried pride in his chest like a heavy stone, pride that his daughter was the one meant for the Hale boy, pride that the vow would endure through her. Yet it was a pride that built walls rather than bridges. Eleanor learned early that his approval was measured, that his touch was seldom gentle, and that his expectations hung over her like the shadow of the ridge itself. By the time she was 5, she knew her letters from a tattered Bible, though her father said too much schooling was wasted on girls. Ruth, however, pressed her to learn, whispering lessons by candlelight, teaching her to read the words of Psalms with a halting rhythm that grew smoother with practice. Those stolen moments were theirs alone, a fragile defiance against the rigid lines the vow had drawn. The Hale family lived less than 5 miles away, but in the mountains 5 miles might as well have been 50 in winter. They came down the trail most often in the warm months, their visits a mix of courtesy and calculation. The boy, named James, was a sturdy child with a broad forehead and a smile that flashed quick, though his eyes held the same hardness that seemed to mark all the Hales. When he and Eleanor were placed together on the porch to play, their parents watching from the shade, neither knew what to make of the arrangement. James shoved sticks into the dirt, building small forts and knocking them down again. Eleanor watched, silent, then reached to place her own stone beside his, only to see it toppled as part of his game. She did not cry. She simply set another stone down, firmer this time. Their mothers looked on, one with guarded hope, the other with an unspoken worry. Their fathers shared nods that were closer to contracts than gestures. As Eleanor grew, so did the weight of what was expected of her. She heard the vow whispered in half-finished sentences, in warnings and in blessings, always present like a low hum beneath daily life. She did not yet understand what it meant, only that her path was marked while others ran free. At night, she sometimes dreamt of the forest, of the trails winding beyond the ridge, of voices calling her name from unseen clearings. She would wake with her chest tight, as if something inside her longed for air beyond the confines of duty. When she turned 8, her father began taking her to the fields, showing her how to plant rows of corn, how to hoe weeds from the soil, how to carry buckets from the spring without spilling a drop. A wife must keep a household, he told her, his voice stern but not cruel, and you'll be one sooner than most. She listened, her small hands gripping the handle of the bucket, her arms aching as she climbed the slope. She never complained. Complaints, she had learned, led only to silence from her father and weary sighs from her mother. The Hale boy, James, came more often as the years passed. He was older by half a year, and already by 9 he carried himself with a confidence that made him seem years ahead. He teased Eleanor, sometimes harshly, sometimes playfully, but always with the certainty that she was his to tease. She accepted it with quiet endurance, though once, when he pushed her too hard into the dirt, she stood, brushed herself off, and struck him across the cheek with the flat of her hand. Their parents had laughed at the sight, taking it as a sign of spirit, though Eleanor felt no amusement. She felt only the burn in her chest, the first flicker of something that told her she was more than a piece of a vow. The mountains held them all in their grip, shaping their lives as surely as water shapes stone. The vow stretched back like the ridges themselves, old and immovable. Yet within the child who bore its weight, something restless stirred, waiting, even then, to test the strength of what had always been. The years moved like the slow current of the creek that cut through the valley, carrying Eleanor from girlhood into the uneasy threshold of adolescence. By 12, her limbs had stretched long and thin, her face beginning to sharpen into the high-boned features of her mother's line. She was neither tall nor short, neither fragile nor sturdy, but she carried herself with a quiet poise that seemed older than her years. The vow was no longer a murmur beyond her understanding. It was spoken to her now, not in whispers but in directives. "You'll stand beside James one day," her father said when she balked at fetching water with him at her side. "You'll tend his home. You'll bear his children. It's been written before you were born." He said it with the certainty of Scripture, as if the words themselves had been carved into the stones of the mountain. Ruth tried to soften it when she could. "It doesn't all come at once, child," she murmured as she braided Eleanor's hair by lamplight. "There's time still for you to run the ridges and learn what you're made of. But the day will come, and you'll need to be ready." There was no rebellion in her tone, only resignation wrapped in affection, as though she herself had once fought against a current that was too strong to outswim. Eleanor's bond with James remained a thing both tenuous and inevitable. Their families saw to it that they spent time together, whether hauling firewood, shelling beans on the porch, or walking the narrow trail to the one-room church on Sundays. James grew into his father's likeness, broad-shouldered, sure of himself, already carrying the air of a boy who believed the world would bend to his will. He teased Eleanor less often now, though not out of kindness, but because he had begun to look at her differently. At 13, he stood taller than most boys his age, his voice beginning to roughen, his eyes carrying the same sharp glint as Silas's did when talk of the vow arose. He spoke of the future as if it were already laid plain before them. "When we're married, I'll build us a new house down by the bend. I'll have the best fields for corn. You'll see." Eleanor listened, nodding, but in the pit of her stomach she felt a coldness she could not name. The idea of belonging to him, of her life tethered in such a way, brought not comfort but unease. She found herself looking past him when he spoke, her eyes drifting to the woods, where the shadows seemed to whisper of paths untaken. It was in those years that she began to slip away whenever she could. The forest became her refuge, the hush of pine needles beneath her feet, the silver thread of the creek, the hidden hollows where ferns grew tall and wildflowers burst with sudden color. She learned which rocks were slick with moss, which trees leaned just enough to be climbed, which places caught the first rays of dawn. Out there, she was not a daughter promised nor a bride in waiting. She was only herself, breathing free, her heart quick with the joy of movement. Ruth noticed the scratches on her arms, the mud on her shoes, the faint smell of damp earth in her hair when she returned. She said nothing at first, only studied her daughter with a look that was half worry, half envy. But one evening, as Eleanor sat by the fire, Ruth spoke. "You've got a wildness in you," she said softly, "more than I ever did. Be careful with it, girl. This place don't much forgive wildness in women." Those words sank deep into Eleanor's chest, though she didn't understand them fully then. She only knew that her mother's gaze held both warning and love, and that whatever wildness lived inside her was not something easily stilled. By 14, the talk of her future with James grew more frequent, more pressing. The Hales spoke openly of it at gatherings, their laughter carrying an edge of triumph, as though the match were already sealed. Silas's pride swelled with every word, while Ruth's silence grew heavier. Eleanor felt the net drawing tighter, each strand of expectation pulling her closer to a fate she had not chosen. One summer afternoon, she and James walked the ridge path alone, the air thick with heat, cicadas screaming from every branch. James strode ahead, a stick in his hand, knocking leaves from low branches as he spoke of the house he'd build, the fields he'd plough, the sons he'd raise. Eleanor trailed behind, her eyes on the horizon, where the blue ridges stretched farther than she had ever travelled. Suddenly, she asked, "Have you ever thought of leaving? Of going past the mountains, seeing what's out there?" James turned, frowning as though she had spoken nonsense. "Why would I leave? Everything we need is here. The land, the family, the vow. It's all that matters. That's what keeps us strong." He looked at her with a steady gaze, his words final, immovable. Eleanor said nothing more, but the question lingered in her mind long after. That night she lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the wind moving through the trees. She thought of the vow, of her father's stern voice, of James's certainty, and of the forest trails that seemed to whisper her name. Something within her knew. The path set before her was not the only one that existed. By the time Eleanor reached her 15th year, the pressure of the vow bore down with a weight that felt unshakable. The elders of both families began to speak of dates, not yet fixed but circling closer with each passing season. To them, time was a rope being pulled tight, drawing the girl and James inevitably together. Eleanor felt it in the way people looked at her, in the sideways glances from cousins at gatherings, in the knowing nods from the older women at church. She was no longer just a daughter. She was a bride in waiting. Every step she took was measured against that fate. Her mother's face grew thinner with the strain of it. Ruth seemed to carry shadows under her eyes, as if she had lived this moment before. Only now she was watching her daughter bear the same yoke. She tried to shield Eleanor in small ways, letting her linger outside longer, giving her errands that took her up the ridge alone, whispering encouragement in the dark when Silas's voice had been too sharp that day. Silas himself grew more rigid as the date of betrothal edged nearer. He began to watch Eleanor with an assessing eye, correcting her posture at the table, reminding her that a wife must keep her chin high but her voice soft. When she misstepped, when she left her chores undone or lingered too long in the forest, he grew stern. He was not a man of quick tempers, but his disappointment cut deeper than anger. James, meanwhile, carried himself with the full assurance of someone already in possession of what was promised. At 16, he was broad of chest and strong of arm, the kind of boy who could split logs in a single stroke and laugh at the sweat running down his back. He spoke often of their future together, his tone less fanciful now and more possessive. "You'll see, Ellie," he said one afternoon as they sat by the creek, their parents just out of sight. "When we're married, you'll want for nothing. I'll give you a house better than your father's, land enough to grow twice the corn. You'll be proud to be mine." She smiled faintly, because that was what was expected, but inwardly the words struck her not with comfort but with unease. Proud to be his. His. Always, that word settled like a stone in her chest. It was during that summer that Eleanor found her way deeper into the forest than ever before. She discovered a hollow past the ridge where the trees grew so close their branches laced together overhead, casting the ground in near constant shade. There, the air was cool and damp, the silence broken only by the distant call of a whippoorwill. She claimed the place as her own, a hidden refuge where no vow could reach her. She began to keep a small journal, written in the margins of an old almanac her mother had once hidden from her father. By firelight or in her shaded hollow, she scrawled her thoughts, questions she dared not ask aloud, fragments of dreams, words she did not even fully understand but felt drawn to put down. It was there she admitted to herself the truth she could not speak. "I do not want to belong to him. I do not want to belong to anyone." But in the world of the mountains, such words, if heard, would carry the weight of sin. One autumn evening, at a gathering of both families, the vow was spoken of more plainly than ever before. Silas lifted his glass and said before the assembled kin, "When the spring planting is done, we'll make the match official. My Eleanor and your James will stand together, as our fathers before us." There was applause, laughter, the clinking of jars. Ruth kept her eyes lowered, her hands tight in her lap. Eleanor sat frozen, her face calm but her blood roaring in her ears. She was only 15, yet the vow had already closed around her like an iron clasp. That night, when the house had grown still, Ruth came to her daughter's bed. She sat on the edge, brushing a strand of hair from Eleanor's forehead. In a low voice she said, "Don't lose yourself, child. Even if they bind you to him, don't let them take all of you." Eleanor turned her face toward her mother, searching her eyes for something. Permission, perhaps, or a way out. But Ruth only pressed her lips tight and kissed her brow, leaving her with more questions than answers. The vow was tightening, but so too was Eleanor's resolve. In the secret places of her heart, she began to imagine what it might mean to resist, to say no, to break free. And in those mountains, where vows were older than memory and blood was bound to blood, the thought itself was dangerous enough to feel like fire. Winter descended with a weight that year, heavier than in Eleanor's memory. Snow piled along the hollow paths until the cabins seemed half buried, smoke rising like thin lifelines into the grey sky. The cold pressed into every crack of the house, and the nights stretched long with silence broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Inside, the air grew taut. Eleanor felt the vow pressing closer, now spoken not as promise but as certainty. The talk of spring had hardened into plans, dates whispered between fathers, the carving of initials on rough-hewn timbers for a house that James and Eleanor were expected to one day share. She was 16 now, and though still more girl than woman in her own eyes, the valley had decided her future was no longer hers. James visited often that winter, trudging across the snow with a boy's eagerness disguised as a man's duty. He sat at the hearth, boots steaming, laughing with Silas and trading plans as though he were already a son of the household. He looked at Eleanor in ways that made her skin prickle, his gaze not cruel, but certain, assured, as though she were already his possession. Sometimes he spoke of their life to come, his voice carrying across the room. "You'll see, Eleanor, by next Christmas, we'll be keeping our own fire. We'll have a pig fattened, chickens in the yard. You'll run the house, and I'll run the fields." Everyone nodded, as if the story had already been lived and told. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the flames. She had grown skilled at hiding what brewed within her, an unease so sharp it sometimes stole her breath. At night, when the house lay still, she pressed her face into the pillow and let silent tears run hot. Not because she feared James's strength or her father's sternness, but because she felt herself fading. Each plan spoken in her name stripped a little more of her away, until she feared that by spring she would no longer exist, only the bride they expected. Her refuge remained the forest, even in the cold. Wrapped in a shawl, boots crunching over frost, she slipped into the trees whenever she could. The hollow she had claimed was changed under snow, its shadows deeper, its quiet even heavier. There she kept her journal close, words scrawled in a hand grown sharper with practice. "They do not ask what I want. They do not see me. They see only the vow. But I am not only the vow. I am something else. I feel it. I don't yet know what it means, but I cannot let them take it from me." The journal became her second voice, her hidden confession. Ruth noticed the heaviness in her daughter. She tried to offer small comforts, a longer embrace at night, an extra slice of cornbread, a hand squeezed in passing. Yet she never spoke against the vow in daylight, never raised her voice against Silas. Her warnings came only in quiet moments. "Hold your heart close, Eleanor. Don't let them break it before it even has its chance to beat free." But warnings were not enough. One bitter morning, Eleanor woke before the others and stepped outside. The sky was pale with dawn, the air biting against her skin. She stood there, breath fogging, staring at the ridge where the sun would rise. And something inside her stirred, a thought more daring than she had ever allowed. What if she left? Not for a walk, not for a day in the forest, but truly left, beyond the ridge, beyond the valley, into the world she had only glimpsed in fragments from traders and travelers. What if she carved her own path? Vow be damned. The thought frightened her with its sharpness, but it also filled her with a strange light. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life that was hers alone, a life where she was not James's bride, not Silas's daughter, not the vessel of a family's twisted promise. The vow had been carved deep, yes, but mountains, even mountains, could be climbed. And that winter, as the snow weighed heavy on the roofs and the valley braced for spring, Eleanor's secret resolve began to take shape. Spring came with a rush of thaw. The snow melted into the creeks, filling them until they roared against their banks. The fields, soaked and black, lay waiting for seed. Buds broke open along the ridges, and the valley stirred back to life. With spring came the tightening of the vow. Preparations shifted from talk to action. The Hales brought gifts, sacks of flour, a quilt stitched by James's mother, a carved wooden chest to be kept for Eleanor's trousseau. Silas accepted each token with pride, his chest swelling as though the exchange confirmed his authority over both families. To Eleanor, each gift felt like another brick in a wall being built around her. She watched as the chest was placed in the corner of the cabin, its polished lid gleaming in the firelight. Inside it lay her future, or rather, the future carved for her. James had grown into a man by outward measure. 17 now, his shoulders broadened from labor, his hands rough and strong. He spoke with confidence, laughed loud, and moved with the certainty of one who believed his life was already decided. He looked at Eleanor as though she were his prize, his promise fulfilled. One afternoon, he came to the McAllister cabin and found her tending the garden with her mother. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, his smile wide. "By harvest," he said, "we'll have our own rows to tend. Won't be long now, Ellie." Ruth looked down quickly, pretending to fuss with the soil. Eleanor straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She met his gaze, her grey eyes steady, though inside her heart thudded like a trapped bird. "Maybe not as long as you think," she said quietly. James chuckled, thinking it a jest, and strode off to help Silas in the fields. But Eleanor's words had not been spoken in jest. They were the first slip of her resolve into the open air. That night, she returned to her hollow in the woods, carrying the journal hidden beneath her shawl. She sat with her back against the tree, the air rich with the smell of damp earth, and she wrote, "They build a house for me. They stitch quilts for me. They carve my name into the timbers of a life I have not chosen, but I will not step into it. I will not." Her resolve hardened with each word. She began to think not just of leaving, but of how. She knew the trails, the ridges, the hidden paths through laurel and pine. She had listened to travelers speak of towns beyond the mountains, places where the vow held no power. She did not yet know when she would go, but the seed had been planted. Her mother seemed to sense it. One evening, as they washed dishes in the fading light, Ruth placed a hand over Eleanor's. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "If you go, child, you must go with courage. Don't look back, for they'll try to pull you back if they can. And don't tell me when. If I know, they'll see it in my face." Eleanor froze, staring at her mother. The words were not permission, not quite, but they were the closest thing to a blessing she could hope for. Ruth's eyes glistened, though she did not cry. She only gave her daughter's hand a squeeze and turned back to the dishes. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the house grew quiet. Her heart raced with fear and with hope. The vow was closing in, its grip stronger than ever. But in her chest, something stronger stirred. Spring had come to the valley, and with it Eleanor's secret decision. She would not be the bride raised for James Hale. She would be her own. The weeks that followed were filled with both preparation and secrecy. On the surface, Eleanor carried herself as expected, helping her mother with chores, answering her father respectfully, enduring James's visits with calm composure. Yet beneath that surface, every step she took was threaded with quiet planning. She began gathering small things in secret. A strip of cloth here, a length of twine there, a few biscuits wrapped in paper when Ruth wasn't looking, though Eleanor suspected her mother noticed and chose silence over questions. She tucked them into a corner of the old barn, hidden beneath a loose board where the dust lay thick and undisturbed. Each time she added something to the small cache, her heart pounded. If Silas found out, the punishment would be swift, though not by hand. His anger was not the kind that lashed out. It was the kind that froze the air, the kind that cut with silence sharper than any blade. But Eleanor could not stop. The thought of springing roots in James's household was more unbearable than the risk of being caught. James himself grew bolder as the betrothal season approached. When they walked the ridge together, he spoke not of dreams now, but of certainty. "We'll be wed by harvest," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man twice his age. "I'll see to it myself." Eleanor listened with a quiet face, but inside, his words only fueled her resolve. One evening, Ruth joined her at the wash basin, their hands dipping into the cool water. Ruth's eyes lingered on her daughter's profile, then shifted quickly away. "I had dreams once," she murmured, so softly Eleanor almost thought she imagined it. "Dreams of a life beyond these mountains. But dreams die when you don't feed them. Don't let yours starve, child." Eleanor turned to her, heart tight in her chest. "Did you ever try to go?" Ruth's hands stilled in the water. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I thought of it, but when you were born, I stayed. And then it was too late." Their eyes met, grey against weary brown. Ruth's gaze held both regret and fierce love, and Eleanor understood then. Her mother would not hold her back. By early summer, Eleanor's plans had grown clearer. She knew the path she would take, the old trail over Blackthorn Ridge, seldom travelled, winding down toward the valley roads where traders passed through. She had watched the traders for years, men with wagons filled with goods, women in bright dresses that seemed to carry the dust of places Eleanor had only imagined. If she could reach that road, perhaps she could follow it farther than the vow could chase her. Yet the thought of leaving tore her in two. For all the vow's cruelty, for all her father's sternness, this was her home. The ridges, the creek, the hollow where she wrote her secret words, these were part of her blood. And Ruth, with her tired eyes and quiet strength, was the tether that bound Eleanor still. One evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, Eleanor sat in her hollow with her journal open. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the hush of twilight pressing close. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "I will leave, not because I do not love them, but because I must love myself enough to live. If I stay, I will vanish. And if I vanish, what was the point of my being born at all?" She closed the book and pressed it to her chest, the decision now solid in her bones. Summer was ripening, and with it came the certainty. Before the vow bound her name to James Hale's, Eleanor McAllister would be gone. The night Eleanor chose was thin with moonlight, the sky a pale sheet stitched with cold stars. Crickets had begun their round, a steady thrumming that made the hollow seem alive with small, indifferent music. She moved through the back door with a quiet that had been practiced for weeks. Soft footfalls, careful breath, a scarf over her dark hair to hide its braid from any chance eyes, and every movement felt like a theft and a prayer at once. Her bundle was small, a change of linen, the journal wrapped in oilcloth, the coins she had secreted away in a hollow of the barn post, the few dried biscuits her mother had wrapped in clean cloth. She had thought of taking more, of carrying the chest the Hales had gifted, of carting off the quilts and carved trinkets, but she had learned the hard way that exile demands speed rather than weight. The trail beyond Blackthorn Ridge required nimbleness and a light pack. She slid her feet into worn shoes, tied them with hands that did not tremble although her heart did, and stepped into the night. The hollow she passed on the way held its breath. The world smelled of frost, of crushed laurel, of the faint metallic tang of river water. She moved between the trees as a shadow moves, aware of every leaf that whispered, every branch that might betray her. There was an old deer path she had used as a child, a narrow cut through underbrush that led up and out toward the ridge. She climbed it now with the careful surety of someone who had practiced this climb alone for years, hoisting herself up where the trail wanted to crumble, testing each root with her weight. At the ridge line she paused, more to steady herself than to rest. Below, the valley slept like a held breath. The lights of the few scattered homes were dim, little moth lights swallowed by the dark. She could see the faint gleam of the Hale farmhouse a mile off, a pale box in the black. She imagined James asleep inside, shoulders heaving under blankets that would one day be his and hers. She imagined her father's silhouette by the hearth, the line of his jaw cut against the lamplight. For a moment the grief of leaving struck her with animal force, the grief of abandoning all that was woven into her from birth. She closed her eyes, let the sorrow pass through, then opened them again and kept walking. The descent was steeper than it had seemed in daylight. Roots snagged the hem of her skirt and rocks shifted underfoot, but she moved with the recklessness of someone with very little left to lose. She thought of Ruth's hand at the wash basin, felt it like an ember pressed into her palm. She had not asked for a farewell, never wanting Silas to see the cracks in her resolve. Ruth had given her the blessing in silence that one evening, an old, dangerous blessing, and Eleanor carried it like a map inside her bones. She reached the lower trail just as the moon leaned behind a cloud and took the night with it. The laurel pressed in close like green walls. Somewhere ahead, the old logging road opened out to the hollow where the traders sometimes camped. If she could reach it by dawn, she might find a wagon headed toward the valley road. She quickened her pace, senses alive to every sound: owl, stream, the rustle of a fox. Then, as she stepped around a fallen hemlock, a voice broke the dark beside her. "Eleanor!" She froze so suddenly the biscuits in her bundle thudded against her ribs. The voice was low, familiar, threaded with something that made the hair along her arms rise. It was not a stranger's voice. It carried the timbre of the holler itself, the cadence of the Hail Men. James stepped from the shadow of the trees, breath puffing in the cold, his outline a dark, unmistakable shape. Behind him another figure loomed. Silas had followed, his strides long and silent, his presence like a stone set in the path. Eleanor's throat closed. Every plan she had honed, every step she had practiced, unspooled at once into the brittle air between them. She had not thought of James as watcher on the ridge. She had told herself, perhaps foolhardily, that he would not be out tonight. Yet here he was, eyes narrowed not with anger, but with something like wounded surprise. "You're leaving," he said, not as accusation so much as confirmation, as if the world had simply remade itself into the shape of her decision. "How?" Eleanor started, then caught herself. She did not stammer. She had rehearsed 1,000 answers, and none suited the rawness of the moment. "I'm going," she said plainly. "I can't." She stopped. Words meant to explain unraveled uselessly. Silas's voice was the cold that came after thunder. "You run in the night like a thief," he said. "Do you think we don't see? Do you think vows are only for the hearing?" He stepped closer, the moonlight catching in the thin hair at his temple. There was sorrow in him that ran deeper than anger. For a moment his face looked older than the years he wore. James looked from father to girl and back again. He was not cruel by nature. He was bewildered, as if some measure of certainty had been plucked away from his hands. "Why?" he asked, the single raw syllable of a boy who had been promised more than he had ever been asked for. Eleanor set her jaw. It surprised her how steady her voice was when she finally spoke. "Because this life isn't mine to give away," she said. "Because I cannot be someone arranged like a trade. Because I want, because I have to find what's beyond the ridges." The words were simple. The forest seemed to hold them like a thing balanced on a knife. Silas's shoulders moved as though burdened. James's face closed like the snap of a trap. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Ruth's voice came, an impossible sound threaded with both terror and steady resolve, from the path behind them. She had followed without their seeing, old footsteps quick on urgent heels. She placed herself between Silas and Eleanor, palms out as if to hold the two worlds apart. "If she goes," Ruth said, and her voice held an edge that cut through the cold, "she goes as my daughter, not as your bargaining, not as some piece you set on a table. If you drag her back, you drag me with her." Silas's face crumpled in a way that made Eleanor's heart break. The man had loved the world he knew, and that love had hardened into a single wrongness. He moved forward, not in the sweep of force, but in the weary, crushing insistence of a man who had never been answered no. "Ruth," he began, but James stepped forward as well, not to seize her, but to hold out his hand in a strange, unsettled gesture of offering. "If you go," he said to Eleanor, voice small, "don't come back to me with hate in your mouth. If this is what you need, then go." He faltered, and the words died like embers. "I can't stop you. But don't make us the enemy." Eleanor stared at the hand he offered, and then at his face. She saw in him not the villain she had feared, but a boy trapped in the same web of expectation. She felt pity, bitter, complicated, and gratitude. There was no warm reconciliation in the moment, only the raw complicatedness of lives knotted together and now being pulled. Silas's breath hitched. He looked from daughter to wife to son in a long, shuddering sweep. The vow had been his anchor. Its undoing left him drifting. He made a choice that felt like the creek of old would letting go. "If she goes," he said slowly, his voice low and rough, "she goes alone. Not mine to chase. Not mine to claim." It was the nearest thing to blessing he could offer, and it landed like a stone in a slow pool, disruptive, altering the surface. Eleanor's legs nearly gave beneath her. Ruth's fingers found hers and squeezed. The press contained worlds. James stepped back into shadow, not pleased, not triumphant, simply still. Silas turned and walked homeward without another word. The night swallowed him as if he had always been a part of the Hollis dark. Eleanor stood in the hollow with her bundle and the taste of copper on her tongue. Ruth drew a long, trembling breath, and then smiled with a kind of fierce joy that broke Eleanor open. "Go," she said. "Find what you're meant for." Eleanor hugged her mother, feeling the thin bones and the fierce heart beneath them. When she pulled away, Ruth touched the oilcloth-wrapped journal without speaking, a silent benediction. Dawn would find them both on the trail. The trader's road would hold possibilities. The hollow had shifted. The binding thread had frayed. Eleanor started to walk again, but she did not hurry. She wanted to look once more at the valley that had shaped her, to memorize the curve of the creek, the line of the ridges, the places she had loved with a love that neither tethered nor owned her. She took one step, then another, and the world widened a little with each footfall. Behind her, in the dark, James watched until she was no more than a suggestion between trees. He spoke a prayer that might have been for himself or for her, and then he turned home. The vow, for all its long history, had been contested in a single night. It had not been broken. Old things do not snap that easily, but it had been challenged, and that challenge would ripple outward. Eleanor kept walking. The road beyond Blackthorn Ridge felt like another world. It was wider, tamped down by wagon wheels and horses' hooves, and it carried the smell of travel. Dust, leather, smoke from far-off camps. Eleanor had never walked it before, only heard of it in the murmured talk of traders, but now it stretched before her with a pull that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. She had left the ridge behind her in the pale light of dawn, the sun bleeding gold across the treetops. Her legs ached from the climb and descent. Her bundle felt heavier than she had imagined, but her spirit was sharper than the pain. She was moving forward, away from the vow, away from the eyes that had claimed her. The first wagon she saw belonged to a man with a thick beard and shoulders like an ox. His wagon creaked under the weight of barrels, and two boys clambered along its side. He slowed when he saw her, suspicion creasing his brow. "You lost, girl?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. Eleanor gripped her bundle tighter. "I'm walking the road. That's all." He looked her over, noting the shawl, the worn shoes, the pale determination in her face. He spat into the dirt. "Roads long. Not a place for someone your age alone." "I'm not lost," she said again, more firmly this time. He studied her a moment longer, then flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward. "Suit yourself," he muttered, the wheels grinding away down the road. She exhaled, a tight breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She didn't know if she had expected kindness or threat, but she understood now that the road would offer neither. It was simply itself, hard, indifferent, unyielding. That first day was the longest. She walked until her feet blistered, then walked further still, driven by the fear that if she stopped, her courage might falter. She passed no other travelers until dusk, when she found the remnants of a camp, ashes still warm, a circle of stones, the faint smell of beans cooked in a pot. She did not linger, afraid of whose fire it might have been, but the sight reminded her that others moved along this road, that she was not the only one to walk away from something. That night, she made a small fire of her own in a hollow beside the road. She ate one of the biscuits, hard and dry, and drank from the canteen she had filled at the creek. She opened her journal by the firelight, her handwriting cramped and hurried. "I am alone, but I am not afraid. The vow lies behind me, and ahead is what I will make. The road does not care who I am, but at least it is mine to walk." She fell asleep with the journal still open, the fire crackling low. Days blurred together. She followed the road as it curved through valleys and wound along rivers. Sometimes she saw smoke in the distance, sometimes cabins tucked against the trees, sometimes only the endless green rise of mountains. She kept her distance from strangers, though she studied them from afar. A woman leading a mule heavy with baskets, a pair of boys carrying rifles, an old man with a sack slung over his back. Each of them seemed to belong to the road in a way she did not yet, but she was learning. On the fourth day, hunger gnawed at her. The biscuits were nearly gone, and her stomach twisted with emptiness. She gathered wild greens, chewed bitter leaves, drank from the streams. She remembered her father's lessons on roots and berries, the knowledge passed down not as kindness but necessity, and she used it now to keep herself alive. Even as she thought of Silas, she felt no regret for leaving, only a strange gratitude for the skills that served her here. On the fifth morning, she reached a crossroad. A crude sign had been nailed to a post. Valley Forge, 12 miles. She traced the letters with her finger, the first written word she had seen beyond her own journal since leaving home. Valley Forge. She had heard the name in whispers, a place where wagons gathered, where trade bustled, where life stretched wider than a single holler. 12 miles. Her feet ached. Her bundle was lighter than when she began, but her heart surged. She tightened her shawl, adjusted her bundle, and set her face toward the new horizon. Behind her, the vow was still alive, whispered in kitchens, clung to by fathers, remembered by boys who had never been asked what they wanted. But ahead of her was something else, something unclaimed. She kept walking, and with every step, the vow loosened its grip a little more. The road to Valley Forge wound through a gorge, where cliffs rose sheer on either side and the air smelled of damp stone. Eleanor's legs trembled from the long march, but she pressed forward, each bend bringing the promise of something beyond the mountains she had always known. By the time she reached the edge of town, the sun was sinking low. The first thing she saw was smoke curling from a dozen chimneys, the air thick with the scent of iron, wood, and baking bread. Valley Forge was not large by any measure, but to Eleanor it seemed vast. A cluster of cabins, shops, and wagons gathered in restless energy, more people in one place than she had ever seen in her life. The noise startled her. Children shouting, wheels clattering over ruts, men calling to one another, dogs barking, sounds layered upon each other until her head spun. She gripped her bundle tight and stepped cautiously into the bustle, her eyes wide. Traders stood at their wagons, selling bolts of cloth, tins of lard, jars of molasses. Women moved between them, baskets hooked on their arms, voices sharp with bargaining. At the edge of the square, a blacksmith's hammer rang steady on iron, sparks flashing like stars in the dimming light. No one looked at her twice. That was the strangest thing of all. In the holler, every glance had weighed her down, measuring her against the vow. Here she was invisible, just another face in a crowd that did not know her name. The anonymity was both terrifying and exhilarating. She wandered through the square until the ache in her stomach could no longer be ignored. The last of her biscuits was gone, and the wild greens she had chewed on the road had left her weak. She stopped at a stall where a woman sold meat pies from a steaming pan. The smell made Eleanor's mouth water. "How much?" she asked, her voice tentative. "2 pennies," the woman replied briskly. Eleanor dug into her bundle, pulling out the small pouch of coins she had hidden. Her hand shook as she counted them. Money her mother had slipped her from the butter and egg sales, saved for years in quiet defiance of Silas's control. She paid the woman and received a hot pie wrapped in paper. The first bite burned her tongue, but she hardly cared. It was the first food she had chosen, bought, and eaten for herself, and the taste filled her with something larger than hunger. That night, Eleanor found a place to sleep in the loft of an abandoned barn at the edge of town. She lay on the hay, the smell sharp in her nose, her journal open in her lap. By lantern light, she wrote, "I have walked beyond the vow. No one here knows my name. No one tells me who I must be. I am frightened, but I am free. That must be enough for now." The days that followed blurred with small victories. She learned where the well stood for water, which stalls sold food for the cheapest coin, which alleys to avoid when drunken men staggered out of the tavern. She offered to sweep porches, carry water, mend seams. A seamstress took pity on her and gave her a corner of work, stitching hems in exchange for bread and a blanket. Eleanor's hands grew calloused, but her spirit grew steadier. At times, though, the weight of loneliness pressed in. She missed Ruth's quiet voice in the evenings, missed even the sound of Silas's boots on the porch, the familiar rhythm of life in the holler. Freedom, she realized, was not without its cost. One afternoon, while fetching water, she overheard 2 men speaking near the well. "McAllister girl," one muttered. "Ran off, they say. Broke the hail vow. Foolishness," the other spat. "No good comes of crossing what's been bound so long. Her kin'll bear the shame." Eleanor's hands tightened on the bucket until her knuckles whitened. The vow had followed her, even here, carried in whispers like a ghost that refused to die. She turned quickly away, her heart pounding. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They still speak of me as if I am theirs, but I am not. Their vow is not my cage. Let them whisper, I will keep walking." She closed the book and lay awake long into the night, staring at the beams of the barn loft. Outside, Valley Forge bustled and quieted in turns, indifferent to the girl lying in the hay. Eleanor knew she had not yet escaped. Freedom was not only walking away, it was learning to root herself in new soil, and though the vow trailed her like a shadow, she would not let it claim her again. Winter came early to Valley Forge. The wind swept down from the mountains with teeth, and the roads turned hard with frost. Eleanor had managed to secure steadier work with the seamstress, Madame Carver, a sharp-eyed widow who measured cloth as if measuring fate itself. The shop smelled of wool, starch, and lamp oil, and Eleanor's fingers grew deft with the needle. She slept in the loft above the shop now, traded her labor for a pallet and meals. It was not comfort, not home, but it was hers. Yet even in this new life, the vow shadowed her. News traveled in crooked ways, carried by traders and travelers. More than once, she heard her name spoken in half-whisper, tied to words like runaway, shame, Hale, McAllister. Each time, her chest tightened. The vow, though left behind, still stretched invisible threads across the mountains, binding her to a story she was trying to shed. One evening, as snow began to fall, a letter arrived at Madame Carver's. It bore no seal, only her name scrawled in a hand she recognized at once. Eleanor held it in shaking fingers. She climbed the narrow stairs to the loft, lit her lantern, and opened it. The handwriting was James's. The words were halting, unpracticed, but true. Eleanor, the hollow is not the same without you. Father speaks less. Mother walks with her head high though her heart is heavy. I do not curse you for leaving. I do not call you traitor. I only ask that you remember the years before the vow weighed so heavy. Remember the creek, the games, the winters we survived. If freedom is yours, I will not take it from you. But if you should ever return, come not as a promise bound to me, but as yourself. Tears blurred the page. She had feared James would carry only bitterness, yet here was something gentler, a letting go, even if imperfect. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside her journal. Weeks passed. Eleanor stitched dresses for women who wanted to look finer than their means, patched trousers for boys who scuffed them in the street. She learned to navigate the rhythm of Valley Forge, the swell of the market, the hush of snow-laden nights. The ache of loneliness never left her entirely, but she learned to bear it, to stitch it into the seams of her new life. One night, Madame Carver found her writing by lantern light. "Always scratching in that book," she remarked. "What do you put in there, girl?" "Truths," Eleanor replied softly. The widow studied her a moment, then nodded. "Keep them. Words outlast thread." Eleanor smiled faintly. She had filled pages with her journey, the vow, the night she fled, the voices in the hollow, the road. Each word was a claim, a stake driven into the ground of her own making. By spring, the mountains softened, ice melting into streams that rushed bright and quick. Eleanor stood one morning at the edge of the road leading west. Beyond Valley Forge lay towns she had never heard of, roads she had never walked. The thought no longer filled her with dread. She turned back to the shop, to the needle and cloth waiting for her, and she realized something profound. The vow no longer owned her. It might linger as a whisper in the hollow, but here she was something else. Here she was Eleanor, with thread in her hands and words on her page, a life stitched by her own choosing. That night she wrote her final entry beneath the lantern's glow. "The vow ends with me. It is not broken in anger, but in walking away. My mother's blessing walks beside me, and my own hands build what comes next. I was raised to be a bride, but I will live as a woman who chose her road." She closed the journal, blew out the flame, and lay down to sleep. Outside, the thawing earth promised new growth. Inside, Eleanor's heart steadied itself like roots in fresh soil. The vow was finished. Her story had only just begun. The vow may be finished, but the shadows of the mountains hold countless more stories. If you want to keep walking deeper into them with me, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay close to eternal Obsidian, where the dark never ends, and neither do the tales.